There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the clock face of a Tuesday night, the scent of stale beer and lemon polish, the sound of a closing door. You don't recognize them as hinges of fate until long after they've swung shut, leaving you in a room you never expected to be in. For me, that moment was a bartender closing my tab. It was a transaction I'd completed 100 times, a simple ritual marking the end of an evening. But on this night, the ritual broke. The world tilted on its axis, and the silence that followed was louder than any music that had ever played in that bar. He had already wiped down the long stretch of worn oak, his movements a familiar, rhythmic balm to the quiet hum of the coolers. The last of the other stragglers had trickled out into the cool night air an hour ago, their laughter fading down the street like a dissipating ghost. It was just us, as it often was. Me, on my usual stool at the far end of the bar, nursing the dregs of a whiskey. And him, Julian, moving through the low-lit space like he was a part of its architecture, as essential as the bricks and the wood. He stacked the last of the clean glasses, the clink of glass on glass a soft, melodic counterpoint to the ticking of the old clock above the liquor shelf. The air was thick with the day's stories, saturated with conversations and confessions, and now, in the aftermath, it was settling into a comfortable peace. A peace I had come to treasure more than I ever admitted, even to myself. "All right, Liam," he said, his voice a low murmur that didn't so much break the silence as become a part of it. "Time to call it a night, I think." I nodded, draining the last warm drop from my glass and sliding it forward. The gesture was automatic, practiced. I pulled my wallet from the back pocket of my jeans, the worn leather a familiar weight in my palm. I fumbled for my card, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy for no particular reason other than the late hour and the pleasant, heavy lethargy that had settled deep in my bones. "Let me just close out," I said, my own voice sounding distant. Julian turned from the register, his face half in shadow, half in the amber glow of the single lamp he always left on behind the bar. His eyes, which I usually saw crinkled in easy amusement or sharp with focus, were soft, unreadable. He walked back towards me, his footsteps silent on the rubber mats. He didn't reach for the check, which he'd left face down beside my empty glass. He didn't look at the card I was holding out to him, a small, useless rectangle of blue plastic. Instead, he stopped directly in front of me, resting his hands on the edge of the bar. The space between us, usually a professional territory of transactions and small talk, suddenly felt charged, intimate. A shoreline where two worlds were about to meet. He looked at my outstretched hand, at the credit card held between my thumb and forefinger. Then he looked up, his gaze meeting mine. And in that look, I saw a universe of exhaustion, of loneliness, of something else I couldn't yet name. It was a vulnerability I had only ever glimpsed in fleeting moments, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of the charming, unflappable bartender. He was the anchor for so many people, the steady presence in the storm of their lives. But I wondered, not for the first time, who was the anchor for him. And then he did it. He reached across the bar, his fingers warm and calloused, and he didn't take the card. He gently, deliberately, bypassed the plastic and wrapped his hand around mine. His thumb stroked over my knuckles, a slow, questioning gesture. He folded my fingers over the card, enclosing it in my own palm, before his hand settled fully over mine, holding it there on the dark, polished wood. The world stopped. The hum of the coolers faded. The ticking of the clock went silent. The distant siren wailing its way across the city ceased to exist. There was only the solid, warm weight of his hand on mine, the slight friction of his skin against my own, and the thunderous, frantic beat of my heart against my ribs. It was a simple gesture, a touch, but it was a dictionary of unsaid things. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the end of one story, and, though I was terrified to even hope it, the beginning of another. The bartender had closed the tab on everything we had been, and with the simple, shocking pressure of his hand, he had opened something new entirely. To understand the weight of that hand, you have to understand the space it occupied. You have to understand the geography of our friendship, a map drawn over 4 years of late nights and quiet conversations across that very same stretch of oak. I had found the alibi by accident, or maybe by the kind of instinct that draws lonely people to quiet, dimly lit corners of the world. I was new to the city, a photographer trying to make a living by capturing the soul of a place that felt, at the time, entirely soulless to me. My apartment was a sterile box of white walls and unpacked boxes, a temporary shelter that had felt temporary for far too long. I spent my days walking, my camera a shield between me and the overwhelming rush of the city, and my nights feeling profoundly, achingly alone. The alibi was a refuge. Tucked between a laundromat and a perpetually closed bookstore, its only sign was a single, discreetly lettered name on the glass. Inside, it was all dark wood, worn leather, and low, golden light. It was a place that felt like it had been holding its breath for 100 years, waiting for you to exhale. And behind the bar, there was Julian. The first time I saw him, he was laughing with a customer, a deep, genuine sound that made the entire room feel warmer. He had a way of moving with an easy, unhurried grace, his hands always busy but never frantic. He was handsome in a way that felt approachable, lived in. Dark hair that was always a little messy, eyes the color of whiskey that saw more than you thought they did, and a smile that could disarm armies. I took my seat at the far end of the bar, the same seat I would come to occupy for years, and he eventually made his way down to me. He didn't ask what I wanted with the bored impatience of so many city bartenders. He just leaned against the counter, wiped a clean spot in front of me, and said, "You look like you've had a long day." It was such a simple observation, but it was the first time anyone in this sprawling, anonymous city had actually seen me. I was so taken aback that I could only nod. "Whiskey, then," he'd said, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. And he was right. That was the beginning. I started coming back, first once a week, then twice, then more nights than not. It became my ritual. I would edit photos on my laptop, the quiet clatter of the keys a part of the bar's ambient soundtrack, and Julian would work, a steady, comforting presence on the other side of the bar. We fell into an easy rhythm. We didn't talk much at first, just exchanged pleasantries. But over time, the conversations grew. He'd ask about my photos, leaning over the bar to look at the images on my screen, his curiosity genuine. He had an artist's eye, I realized. He'd point out details I thought only I had noticed. The way the light hit a crumbling brick wall, the lonely posture of a man waiting for a bus. He saw the stories I was trying to tell. In return, I learned about him in fragments, pieces of a mosaic assembled over years. I learned he'd grown up in a small town, that he'd come to the city for college and never left. I learned that he had wanted to be a musician once, a guitarist, but that life had a way of rerouting you. He never sounded bitter when he said it, just resigned, a quiet melancholy clinging to the edges of his words. The bar was his stage now, he'd once joked, and the cocktail shaker was his instrument. I learned about his long-term girlfriend, Sarah, a woman I only ever saw in glimpses when she'd stop by to say hello. She was bright and bubbly and seemed, to my admittedly biased eye, to exist on a completely different frequency than Julian. When she was there, he seemed to shrink a little, his easy smile becoming something more practiced, more performative. I, the quiet observer, saw the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze would drift away when she was talking. And I, of course, fell for him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic fall. It was a slow erosion, a gradual sinking into a feeling so deep and vast I didn't recognize it as love until I was already submerged. It was in the way my stomach would tighten when he'd single me out with a smile from across the crowded room. It was in the way I started framing photographs in my mind with him as the subject. Julian, bathed in the golden light of the bar, his brow furrowed in concentration as he measured out a pour. Julian, laughing, his head thrown back, a fleeting moment of pure, unguarded joy. He became my secret muse, the silent subject of my best work, even if the photos only ever existed in my head. I kept it buried, of course. I buried it so deep I could almost convince myself it wasn't there. He was my friend, my only real friend in this city. He was straight. He had a girlfriend. The list of reasons was a fortress I built around my heart, and for years it held. Our friendship was this precious, fragile thing, a delicate ecosystem built in the quiet hours of a neighborhood bar. It was a safe harbor, and I was terrified of being the storm that would wreck it. So I played my part. The quiet photographer at the end of the bar, the good friend, the keeper of his casual complaints and his fleeting observations. I listened, and I watched, and I yearned in a silence so profound it had its own sound. The years passed like this, in a comfortable, aching stasis. I had my work, I had my apartment, and I had my nights at the Alibi, orbiting the quiet gravity of Julian. It was a lonely existence, but it was stable. It was a life built around a beautiful, impossible thing, and I had accepted that. I had made my peace with being the satellite, forever in orbit, never to land. The first tremor that shook that stable orbit came on a rainy Tuesday in October. The bar was empty, the weather having driven everyone to the warmth of their own homes. I was there naturally. The rain streaking down the large front window made the bar feel like a submarine, a cozy vessel moving through a dark, watery world. Julian was quiet that night, his usual energy banked, his movements slow and heavy. He polished the same glass for 10 minutes, his eyes distant and unfocused. I knew something was wrong. In our years of quiet communion, I had learned to read his silences. There was the comfortable silence of a slow night, the thoughtful silence of him working through a problem, and then there was this, a hollow, brittle silence that felt like it could shatter at the slightest touch. Finally, he set the glass down and leaned his elbows on the bar, rubbing his temples. "Sarah and I broke up," he said, the words falling into the quiet room with the weight of stones. I wasn't surprised. I had seen it coming in the way a sailor sees a change in the sky. I'd seen the growing distance, the forced smiles, the way they seemed to talk at each other rather than to each other. But hearing it spoken aloud was different. It made it real. It cracked open a door in my fortress of reasons, a door I immediately tried to slam shut. "I'm sorry to hear that, man," I said, and I was. I was sorry for his pain, for the end of a chapter in his life, no matter how inevitable it had seemed from my distant vantage point. My own selfish, treacherous hope was a thing to be wrestled with later, in the privacy of my own mind. Right now, he was just my friend, and he was hurting. He shrugged, a gesture that was meant to be casual, but was anything but. It was a long time coming. We were just in different books, you know? Not even on different pages. He looked up at me, and for the first time, the charming bartender was gone. In his place was just a man, tired and adrift. "The worst part," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "is the quiet. Coming home to an empty apartment. It's so loud. I understood that kind of quiet. I lived in it. I had built a home there. That night was the shift. After he closed up, he asked if I'd stay for one more. A staff drink, he called it, even though I wasn't staff. We sat there in the near darkness, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, and he talked. He didn't talk about Sarah much, but about the space she had left behind. He talked about the loneliness that had been creeping in for months, a slow tide he had been trying to ignore. He talked about feeling stuck, like he was performing a version of himself every night, and he was starting to forget who the real person was underneath. I just listened. I didn't offer advice or empty platitudes. I just held the space for him, letting him fill the silence with his quiet grief. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. When we finally left, standing under the awning as the rain drizzled down, he clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Thanks, Liam, for listening. It's good to not be alone with it." That was the catalyst. He had come home to a loud, empty apartment, and he had found a temporary reprieve in my quiet company. He started asking me to stay after closing more often. It became our thing. The after-hours drink. The ritual. The bar, once a public space, transformed into our private sanctuary. In those hushed hours, with the chairs stacked on the tables and the world outside asleep, the carefully maintained distance between us began to dissolve. The oak bar was no longer a barrier, but a shared table. He'd talk about his day, the ridiculous customers, the small frustrations. And I'd talk about my work, the challenges of a new project, the elusive search for the perfect shot. We were just two lonely men, finding solace in a shared silence. That's what I told myself. It was easier than admitting the truth, that every minute I spent with him in that quiet, dimly lit room was both a balm and a torture. My carefully constructed fortress was crumbling, brick by brick, with every shared glance, every quiet confession. The ritual evolved. One night, a few weeks after the breakup, he was bone-weary. A brutal Saturday shift had left him drained, his movements sluggish, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. As we sat with our whiskeys, his head started to nod. He caught himself once, twice, shaking his head as if to clear it. "I don't think I can face the subway ride home," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. And then the 4 flights of stairs. "I think I'd just lay down on the sidewalk and die." A gentle, dry humor was his defense against everything, especially his own vulnerability. "You can crash on my couch," I said. The words left my mouth before I had time to think about them, before the fortress walls could be rebuilt. My apartment was just a 2-minute walk away, a cozy, cluttered space above a flower shop. He looked at me, a flicker of something, relief, gratitude, in his tired eyes. "You sure? I don't want to impose, it's just a couch," I lied. It was so much more than a couch. It was a line, a boundary, and we were about to cross it. That was the first night. I remember every detail. The sound of our footsteps echoing on the empty street. The scent of rain-soaked pavement and the faint, sweet smell of sleeping flowers from the shop below as I unlocked the door to my building. The way he looked around my small living room, which was more of a studio, filled with stacks of photography books, prints tacked to the walls, and the organized chaos of my life. He seemed to fill the space, his presence larger, more solid here than it was in the expansive bar. I gave him a blanket and a pillow, my hands feeling strangely clumsy as I handed them over. "The bathroom's there. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen," I said, retreating towards my own bedroom. "Good night, Julian." "Night, Liam. And thanks." Really, I closed my bedroom door, but not all the way. I left it ajar, a habit from a childhood I couldn't remember. I lay in my bed, staring at the sliver of light from the living room that cut across my floor. I could hear him moving around, the soft thud of his shoes on the floor, the creak of the couch springs as he settled in. And then, silence. A different kind of silence. Not the empty quiet of my usual nights, but a full silence. A silence that contained another person, another beating heart, another life breathing just a few feet away. I didn't sleep for hours. I just listened to the sound of his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that was the most comforting and terrifying sound I had ever heard. He left before I woke up, leaving the blanket folded neatly on the couch and a scribbled note on my kitchen counter. "Thanks again. You're a lifesaver. Coffee's on me next time." I thought it would be a one-time thing, an anomaly born of exhaustion. But it wasn't. It became the new ritual. Maybe once a week, then twice, after a particularly long shift or when the loneliness in his eyes was too deep to ignore, he would ask, "Hey, is the couch available tonight?" And I would always say yes. My apartment became his halfway house, a decompression chamber between the noise of the bar and the echoing silence of his own empty home. He never brought a bag, never left a toothbrush. He maintained the fiction that this was a temporary, circumstantial arrangement. Plausible deniability. We were just friends, one friend helping out another. But the lines were blurring, the edges of our carefully defined relationship softening and bleeding into one another. I learned the topography of his sleep. I learned that he sometimes mumbled fragments of orders or names of liquors. I learned that he kicked the blanket off, and I would find myself, in the dead of night, tiptoeing into the living room to gently pull it back over him, my heart pounding with a mixture of tenderness and fear. I would stand there for a moment in the darkness, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, and the yearning would be a physical ache inside me. It was a dangerous, intoxicating intimacy. I was a cartographer, mapping the coast of a country I knew I could never truly inhabit. We developed a domesticity that had no name. I'd wake up some mornings to find him already in the kitchen, making coffee, his hair a mess, wearing the t-shirt he'd worn the night before. He'd pass me a mug, our fingers brushing, and we'd stand there in the morning light, a comfortable silence between us that felt more married than any couple I knew. We were building a home in the spaces between words, a fragile structure held together by unspoken things. I lived for those nights and dreaded them in equal measure. My anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days. I was dissecting every word, every gesture. When he'd fall asleep on the couch while we were watching a movie, his head sometimes lolling onto my shoulder, I would stop breathing. I would sit there, ramrod straight, my muscles screaming, terrified to move, to wake him, to break the spell. I was a bomb disposal expert, and my own heart was the bomb. One wrong move, one misinterpreted signal, one moment of revealing my own feelings, and everything would detonate, leaving nothing but the wreckage of our friendship. He was the unknowing initiator. He was the one who was pushing the boundaries, seeking the comfort, leaning into the warmth. But he did it all under the guise of friendship and exhaustion. I, the quiet observer, could only watch and wonder. Was this just what he needed to get through a hard time? Was I just a convenience, a warm body to fill the void Sarah had left? Or was there something more? Was it possible that he was feeling the same magnetic pull that I was, but was too confused or scared to name it? I swung wildly between hope and despair, sometimes in the space of a single minute. It was an exquisite form of torture. This delicate, terrifying dance went on for months. The seasons changed. The autumn rain gave way to the first snow of winter. The world outside my window grew cold and quiet, while the world inside my small apartment grew warmer, more complicated, more charged with every passing night he spent on my couch. We had built this strange, intimate life that existed only within the four walls of my apartment and the quiet after-hours of his bar. It was a bubble, and I was terrified of the moment it would inevitably pop. And then came the night of the transaction, the night the world tilted. It was a few days before Christmas. The city was a chaotic swirl of frantic shoppers and festive lights, but inside the alibi, it was the same calm oasis. It had been a busy night, and Julian was running on fumes. By the time the last customers had gone, he looked transparent, all his energy depleted. We went through our ritual, the after-hours drink, the quiet conversation. He was more subdued than usual, his gaze lingering on the pathetic little tinsel garland he draped over the mirror behind the bar. "I hate this time of year," he said quietly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Everything is so loud, so bright. Everyone's supposed to be so happy." He didn't have to say the rest. And I'm not. When we walked back to my apartment, the snow was falling, thick, silent flakes that muffled the sound of the city and turned the world soft and white. It felt like we were the only two people alive. Back in my apartment, we didn't turn on the television. We just sat in the dim light, watching the snow fall outside my big picture window. He didn't take the couch. He sat in the worn armchair opposite it, and I sat on the couch, and the space between us felt vast and empty. The usual easy comfort was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the radiator. I watched him, his face illuminated by the reflected glow of the snow and the streetlights. He looked lost. He looked like a man who had been navigating by a map only to find that the landscape had changed completely, and he no longer knew which way was home. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. "Liam," he said, his voice rough, "what are we doing?" The question hung in the air between us, terrifying and vital. It was the first time either of us had acknowledged the unspoken thing that had been growing between us. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The moment the bomb would go off. I could lie. I could play dumb. I could say, "What do you mean? You're my friend. You're crashing on my couch." I could retreat to the safety of the fortress. But I was so tired of those walls. I was so tired of being safe and alone. "I don't know, Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you want us to be doing?" He held my gaze, and I saw a battle being waged in his eyes. Fear and longing, confusion and a desperate kind of clarity. He stood up from the armchair and walked over to the couch. He didn't sit down next to me. He knelt on the floor in front of me, so our faces were level. The move was so unexpected, so vulnerable. It stole the breath from my lungs. He reached out, not for my hand, but to gently cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to my core. "I'm so tired of being confused," he whispered, his eyes searching mine. "The only thing that's made any sense for months is this. Being here. With you." He paused, his breath catching. "Would it be okay?" It was the gentlest of questions. Would it be okay if I stopped pretending? Would it be okay if I admitted that this is more than friendship? Would it be okay if I kissed you? I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a small, jerky movement. And then he leaned in, slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. He closed the final inch between us, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was a question. It was a confession. It was soft and tentative and unbelievably gentle. It was the taste of whiskey and winter and a loneliness so profound it could only be answered by another. It was the sound of a lock I never knew I was carrying finally clicking open. In that one, simple, earth-shattering kiss, the entire world rearranged itself. The satellite had finally, impossibly, come home. But the aftermath of an earthquake is never calm. The ground continues to shift. Structures that have been damaged collapse. The world, having been rearranged, has to settle into its new, unfamiliar form. The morning after the kiss was a landscape of quiet, unnerving tension. I woke up first, to the gray light of dawn filtering through the window. For a moment, I was disoriented. Then it all came rushing back. The snow, the question, the feel of his lips on mine. He hadn't slept on the couch. After the kiss, after we had pulled apart and just looked at each other for a long, silent moment, he had simply said my name, a quiet plea. I had taken his hand and led him to my bedroom. We hadn't done anything more than hold each other, lying face to face in the darkness, his breath warm on my skin. It was more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. Now, he was still asleep, his arm draped over my waist, his face peaceful in a way I had never seen it before. The sight of him in my bed, in my space, was so overwhelmingly right that it terrified me. This was the thing I had wanted for years, a dream so deeply buried I had treated it as a fantasy. And now it was real. And reality is fragile. It can be broken. I must have moved, because his eyes fluttered open. He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw that same piece from his sleep. Then, recognition dawned, and with it, a shadow. Panic. He pulled his arm back as if he'd been burned. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, not looking at me. I should go," he mumbled, his voice thick. "I have to open the bar early for a delivery." It was a clumsy, transparent lie. It was Saturday. There were no early deliveries on Saturday, but I didn't call him on it. I just watched, my heart sinking into a cold, dark pit, as he scrambled out of bed and pulled on his clothes from the night before. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, a man escaping the scene of a crime. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Julian," I said, my voice small. "I'll see you around, Liam," he said, his hand already on the bedroom doorknob. And then he was gone. I heard the front door of the apartment open and close, and then there was only silence. The loud, empty silence he had once told me he hated. It had come back, and it had brought friends, confusion, hurt, and a crushing, suffocating sense of shame. I had been a fool, a complete and utter fool. I had misinterpreted everything. The late nights, the couch, the confession, the kiss. It had all been a product of his loneliness and confusion after his breakup. I wasn't a destination. I was a rest stop, a temporary harbor in his storm. And now that the storm was passing, he was setting sail again, leaving me washed up on the shore. The pain was a physical thing, a tight, brutal band around my chest. I had let him in. I had dismantled my fortress, brick by painful brick, and for what? To be left standing in the ruins, more exposed and alone than ever before. I didn't go to the bar that night, or the next. I couldn't. I couldn't bear to see him, to face the polite, professional distance he would surely put between us. I couldn't go back to being the quiet customer at the end of the bar, not now. Not after he had been in my bed. The thought of it made me sick. I walked the city for hours, my camera hanging and used around my neck. I couldn't see the beauty in anything. The world had gone gray. After 3 days of radio silence, I knew I couldn't live in this limbo. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I deserved an explanation. Or maybe I just deserved the final, clean cut of rejection. Either way, I needed something to stop this slow bleeding. I went to the bar late on a Tuesday, the same night of the week that the shift had begun. I waited until closing, watching him from my old stool. He was all business, the charming bartender in full effect, laughing with customers, moving with his usual grace. But I saw the cracks. I saw the tightness around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. He was avoiding my gaze, pretending I was just another fixture. When the last customer had left and the lock had clicked on the door, he turned to me, his face a mask of weary resignation. "Liam," he started. "Don't." I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't you dare act like nothing happened," he flinched. He leaned against the back bar, surrounded by bottles of amber liquid, and suddenly he looked very small. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice low. "Try the truth," I said, the words bitter on my tongue. "Was it just a mistake? Were you just lonely? Was I just convenient? Just tell me, Julian. Just be honest. I can take it. What I can't take is this ghosting. After everything. I deserve more than that." He looked up at me then, and his eyes were filled with a misery so profound it momentarily silenced my anger. "You think that's what this is?" he whispered. "You think you were just convenient? What else am I supposed to think? You kissed me, you slept in my bed, and then you ran like the building was on fire. You haven't called, you haven't texted. You've been avoiding my eyes all night." He pushed off the back bar and walked towards me, stopping on his side of the oak divide. He gripped the edge of the wood, his knuckles white. "I ran because I was terrified," he said, his voice raw with an emotion I couldn't place. "Not of you. I ran because I was terrified of what I felt." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "My entire life, Liam, I've had a path. A map. You go to school, you get a job, you meet a nice girl, you get married. That's the story. I was with Sarah for 5 years, trying to make that story work, even though it felt like I was reading it in a foreign language. It was what I was supposed to want." He finally looked me straight in the eye. "And then there was you. You were just there. This quiet, steady presence. You never asked for anything. You just saw me. The real me, I think. The person I was under the bartender costume. And being around you felt more like home than my actual home ever did." His confession came out in a torrent, as if a dam had broken. "When Sarah and I ended it, I was relieved. And that scared me. But what scared me more was why. It was because the only thing I wanted to do was come here and sit in the quiet with you. And then it wasn't enough to be here. I wanted to be at your apartment. And then sleeping on the couch wasn't enough. And when I kissed you, it was the first thing in my entire life that felt completely, 100% honest. And it wrecked me." He let go of the bar and scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'm not built like you, Liam. You're so self-contained. You know who you are. I'm a mess. I've spent my whole life trying to be the person everyone else expected me to be. And what I felt for you, what I feel for you, it doesn't fit the map. It doesn't fit the story. And the morning after, I woke up and I saw you, and it was so real, and all I could think was, I'm going to ruin this. I'm going to ruin him. You deserve someone who isn't a complete coward, who isn't a confused disaster." I stared at him, my anger melting away, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. All this time, I had been so wrapped up in my own fear of rejection, my own narrative of unrequited love, that I hadn't truly seen his. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. I slid off my stool and walked around the bar, closing the distance between us. I stood in front of him, in his space, and I waited until he met my eyes again. "You're right about one thing," I said softly. "I do know who I am, and I know what I want. And I'm not as self-contained as you think. My world has been tilted on its axis for years because of you." I took a breath, the confession feeling like a release of a pressure I had been holding for an eternity. "And you're wrong about another thing. You're not going to ruin me. The only thing that was ruining me was the silence. The not knowing." I reached out, and took his hand. The same hand that had held mine on that fateful night. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, desperately. "So what if it doesn't fit the map?" I said. "Maybe it's time to draw a new one." Together, he looked down at our joined hands, and then back up at me, and I saw the fear in his eyes finally recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. A tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek, and I reached up with my free hand to wipe it away. "Okay," he whispered. Just that one word. But it was everything. It was a promise. It was a beginning. It was the first step onto a new, uncharted territory. We didn't magically solve everything in that moment. The conversation that followed was long and messy and honest. There were more tears and admissions of fear from both sides. He had to unpack a lifetime of expectations, and I had to unlearn years of self-protective solitude. But we did it together, in the quiet sanctuary of the closed-down bar, with the ghost of our old friendship watching over us as we laid the foundation for something new. The resolution wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was a series of quiet, deliberate choices. It was Julian, the next morning, showing up at my apartment door not with a mumbled excuse to crash, but with a bag of groceries and a shy smile. It was him asking, "Is it okay if I stay?" And I don't mean on the couch. It was the two of us, cooking dinner together in my small kitchen, bumping elbows, moving in a new, slightly awkward but wonderful rhythm. It was him, finally bringing a toothbrush and leaving it in the holder next to mine, a small, mundane object that felt like the most profound symbol of permanence. The couch went back to being just a couch. My bedroom door was now closed at night, not to keep a sliver of the world out, but to keep our world in. The silence in my apartment was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but the full, rich silence of shared space. It was the sound of pages turning as we read side by side, the soft click of my camera shutter as I finally allowed myself to photograph my muse, the steady, comforting sound of his breathing next to me in the dark. He was still the charming bartender to the rest of the world, but to me, he was just Julian. The man who mumbled liquor orders in his sleep, who had a surprisingly encyclopedic knowledge of bad 80s movies, who made the best coffee I'd ever tasted. And I was no longer just the quiet photographer at the end of the bar. I was Liam, the man he came home to, the man who learned to open his heart after keeping it locked away for so long. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and you don't know they are the beginning of everything until you look back from a future you couldn't have dared to imagine. That night, when Julian took my hand instead of my card, he wasn't just closing a tab. He was closing a door on a life of loneliness for both of us. He was opening a new one. And what I learned, what we learned together, is that the most beautiful thing about a new door is not knowing exactly what's on the other side. It's the quiet, hopeful, terrifying, and ultimately peaceful act of stepping through it together and realizing you've finally found a place to unpack your boxes, to hang your pictures, to build a home. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.